It is just after midnight on June 6, 1944, somewhere in the bocage country of Calvados, Normandy. A resistance saboteur crouches at the base of a telegraph pole beside a quiet farm lane, listening. Somewhere out at sea, though nobody on this lane yet knows it, the greatest invasion fleet in history is already closing on the coast. The saboteur's hands move quickly in the dark. A lump of putty-like explosive, no larger than a bar of soap, is pressed around the thick black cable running up the pole towards the German signals exchange 3 kilometers away. Into the explosive goes a thin metal tube, scarcely bigger than a cigarette. A sharp squeeze between finger and thumb crushes a tiny glass vial inside it. Nothing happens. No spark, no hiss, no flame. The saboteur simply stands, brushes the mud from their knees, and walks unhurriedly back towards the hedgerow, melting into the darkness. Somewhere inside that little metal tube, an almost invisible chemical process has already begun, eating through a wire thinner than a human hair. In 10 minutes, or perhaps an hour, depending on which colored band was fitted, that wire will finally part. A spring will release, a striker will fall, and a length of cable that once connected a German headquarters to its forward defenses will simply cease to exist. Behind the saboteur, unseen in the dark, a courier on a bicycle waits at the junction of 2 lanes, a child's satchel slung across her shoulders. Inside it, wrapped in waxed paper beneath a loaf of bread, sit 3 more of those small metal tubes and enough explosive to silence 2 further stretches of cable before sunrise. Neither of them will fire a shot tonight. Neither of them needs to. This single device, undramatic to look at and almost silent in use, became one of the quiet, decisive instruments of the Normandy campaign. It is rarely mentioned in the popular history of D-Day, which tends to dwell on landing craft and naval bombardments, gliders, and beach obstacles. Yet, in the hours before and after the first soldier waded ashore, the ability of German commanders to pick up a telephone and learn what was happening, and to issue orders in response, mattered every bit as much as the guns on the beaches. A great deal of effort had gone into making sure the telephone, more often than not, would ring out into silence. The story of how Britain built a tool small enough to fit in a coat pocket, yet capable of unpicking an entire enemy communications network in a single coordinated night, begins not on a battlefield but in a converted country house in Hertfordshire, and it says a great deal about how the Second World War was actually won. By the spring of 1944, German forces occupying France depended on one thing above almost everything else to defend against invasion: speed of communication. Their armored divisions were dispersed deep inland, kept back from the coast specifically so they could be rushed to wherever the Allies actually landed, once that location became clear. The entire strategy rested on a simple assumption that orders could travel from headquarters to frontline units in minutes rather than hours. For that, the Wehrmacht relied overwhelmingly on landline telephone and telegraph cable rather than radio. Wireless transmissions could be intercepted, direction found, and in many cases decrypted. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been quietly reading a remarkable proportion of high-grade German signals traffic for years. A telephone call along a buried or pole-mounted cable, by contrast, was almost impossible to eavesdrop on without physical access to the line itself, and orders could be passed with a clarity and speed that radio, with its static, jamming, and coding delays, simply could not match. France's pre-war telephone and telegraph infrastructure, expanded and reinforced under occupation, had become the nervous system of the German defense. This created an obvious target, but a deceptively difficult one. Early resistance attempts to interfere with the network were crude and dangerous. A man with a hacksaw or a pair of bolt cutters could sever a cable, certainly, but only by remaining exposed at the foot of a pole or beside a roadside trench for several minutes, sawing through armored cabling that was often considerably tougher than domestic wire. The work was loud in the stillness of curfew hours, and German patrols knew to listen for exactly that sound. Worse, a cable cut by hand failed immediately and obviously, often while the saboteur was still within sight of the damage, leaving little time to get clear before a passing patrol or an alerted repair crew arrived. Reprisals for sabotage were severe and frequently fell not only on those caught but on entire villages near an attack. By 1943, resistant circuits across occupied France were being urged by London to step up attacks on communications, but the tools available to do so safely, repeatedly, and at scale simply did not exist. France's wired network, much of it inherited from a pre-war civilian telephone and telegraph system, and then heavily extended by German signal regiments, ran to many thousands of kilometers of overhead and buried cable, far more than any single circuit of resistance fighters could realistically hope to dismantle through brute manual effort alone. Worse, the network had been deliberately built with a degree of redundancy, multiple parallel routes between major centers, so that a handful of scattered cuts achieved with hacksaws barely registered as an inconvenience before repair crews, working in well-organized pairs along familiar routes, restored service within hours. What was needed was something that civilians with no engineering training could carry concealed, use in seconds rather than minutes, and walk away from long before anything happened, and something that could be deployed in sufficient numbers on the same night to overwhelm the network's capacity for self-repair faster than it could respond. Nothing in conventional military demolition equipment, designed for engineers working under covering fire rather than for a baker or a schoolteacher working alone after curfew, came close to meeting that brief, and the clock, with an invasion now being planned in detail, was running out. The answer came from a requisitioned Hertfordshire mansion called Aston House, near Stevenage, designated Station 12 and run under the deliberately dull cover name of the Inter-Services Research Bureau. Alongside its sister establishment at the Frythe, near Welwyn Garden City, Aston House was where the Special Operations Executive designed the tools of clandestine sabotage, limpet mines for ship hulls, incendiary devices disguised as everyday objects, and a whole family of switches and fuses built for people who were not soldiers and would never receive proper demolition training. Among the men working there was Commander A.J.G. Langley, the station's first commandant, credited with inventing what became known, with typical understatement, as the time pencil. The mechanism was almost embarrassingly simple. A slender metal tube, roughly the size of a fountain pen, was divided into two halves. One end held a small glass vial filled with a corrosive chemical. The other contained a coiled spring under tension, held back only by a thin wire and tipped with a striker that, once released, would fire forward like a tiny piston. To set the device, the operator simply crushed the glass vial between finger and thumb, releasing the chemical onto the restraining wire. From that moment, the wire began to corrode, slowly thinning until it could no longer hold the spring back. When it finally snapped, the striker shot forward into a percussion cap, igniting a detonator packed into whatever charge of plastic explosive had been molded against the target. Different pencils were color-coded for different delays, ranging from a matter of minutes to many hours, allowing a single saboteur to set several charges along a stretch of cable, each timed to detonate at a slightly different moment, multiplying the confusion. A later refinement, the L-delay switch, replaced the corroding wire with one made from a soft lead alloy that simply crept and stretched under spring tension until it parted, a method considerably less sensitive to extremes of heat or cold than Langley's original chemical design, which had an unfortunate habit of running fast in hot weather and dangerously slow in cold. Paired with the time pencil was the explosive itself, a putty-like compound that British and American chemists had been refining throughout the war, moldable by hand like modeling clay and stable enough to be cut, shaped, and carried in a coat pocket without special precautions. A charge weighing only a few hundred grams, roughly the heft of a bar of soap, wrapped around a cable or pressed into the base of a wooden telegraph pole, was more than sufficient to sever the line cleanly. The detonation lasting no longer than the snap of a car door, yet entirely capable of parting a cable several centimeters thick. Crucially, because the explosive could be molded into almost any shape, it could be disguised, packed into the lining of a coat, hidden beneath loaves of bread or laundry in a bicycle basket, and carried past German checkpoints by couriers who were frequently women, since they attracted less suspicion and were searched less often than men. Aston House and its associated workshops produced and packed these components in quantities that remain difficult to pin down with precision, since much of the paperwork was deliberately destroyed or never created in the first place. But historians generally agree that more than 10,000 tons of arms, explosives, and equipment were parachuted into France to resistance circuits between 1941 and 1944, much of it built around exactly this combination of plastic explosive and delayed action switch. Production of the time pencils themselves was farmed out, for reasons of security and capacity, to small engineering firms across the home counties who had no idea what their precision-turned brass and copper components were ultimately destined for. Each batch tested for reliability before being packed by the thousand into watertight containers ready for the next moonlit supply flight. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's plenty more of this kind of quietly remarkable engineering still to come. The opportunity to use this equipment at scale arrived in the weeks surrounding the Normandy landings, under a scheme that Allied planners had codenamed Plan Violet, one strand of a wider sabotage program that also targeted railways, roads, fuel dumps, and power stations. While Plan Vert tore up the rail network and Plan Tortue blocked the roads, Plan Violet's explicit purpose was to blind the German command structure by attacking its telephone and telegraph links in the days immediately before and after the invasion. Resistance cells across northern France, supplied with explosives and time pencils, airdropped over the preceding months and increasingly reinforced by Jedburgh teams parachuted in directly to coordinate local action, moved against telephone exchanges, relay stations, and long stretches of cable simultaneously. Records compiled after the war suggest that something in the order of 32 telecommunication sites were put out of action through this campaign around the period of the landings. The practical effect, as far as it can be reconstructed from surviving German signals logs and after-action reports, was that several headquarters found themselves unable to reach forward units by telephone at the precise moment speed mattered most, forcing staff officers onto radio sets that Bletchley Park was, by sheer coincidence of strategy, already extremely well placed to listen to. Exact casualty figures among resistance saboteurs caught in the act remain patchy and, in many cases, simply unrecorded, a reminder that this was a campaign fought by amateurs with everything to lose and almost nothing in the way of official protection if captured. It is worth being honest about what can and cannot be claimed here. German signals troops were experienced and resourceful, and many severed lines were repaired within hours rather than days. Accounts gathered after the war describe exasperated German telephone exchange staff working through the night with spliced cable and replacement poles, only to find a fresh cut waiting for them a few kilometers further along the same route the following evening, the saboteurs having simply moved on to the next stretch of line while repair crews were still occupied with the last. This was never a single knockout blow. It was hundreds of small, almost simultaneous cuts, each individually minor, that collectively degraded a system built for speed at precisely the moment speed was everything. The Wehrmacht itself never developed a comparable program for the simple reason that it was not fighting an occupation. There was no equivalent enemy network running beneath its own territory for German agents to attack in the same way, and what passed for German anti-sabotage doctrine relied almost entirely on deterrence through reprisal, rather than any technical countermeasure capable of detecting a charge already in place. The closer comparison is with the American Office of Strategic Services, which ran parallel sabotage operations in France and frequently relied on British-supplied time pencils and plastic explosive rather than a wholly separate domestic equivalent, since nothing produced in the United States at the time matched the British devices for compactness and reliability, although American chemists made significant contributions of their own to the underlying explosive formulations used by both services. What set the British approach apart was not any single dramatic innovation, but the deliberate design philosophy behind it. Assume the user has no training. Assume the device must work after weeks stored in a damp barn or buried in a field. And assume above all that the person setting it needs time to walk away unnoticed before anything happens. That last requirement, more than any explosive chemistry, was the genuine breakthrough, and it is a philosophy that quietly shaped the design of clandestine equipment for every Allied service that adopted it. Assessing the precise historical impact of this campaign honestly requires some caution, since sabotage of communications networks is, by its nature, difficult to separate from the dozens of other factors that slowed the German response to D-Day, including Allied air superiority over the roads and railways, deception operations that kept entire divisions pinned near Calais, and simple confusion within a command structure where senior officers, Rommel among them, were away from their posts when the landings began. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the systematic targeting of telephone and telegraph lines removed one of the German Army's genuine advantages, a fast and largely secure communications system, at the precise moment it was most needed, and that the psychological effect on signals officers discovering their network, silent, line after line, should not be underestimated, even where the material delay it caused cannot be measured to the hour. There is a real distinction worth drawing between the material effect of any single cut cable, which a competent repair crew could mend before breakfast, and the cumulative psychological effect on a headquarters staff who could no longer trust that any line, however recently checked, would still be working an hour later. That uncertainty, multiplied across dozens of exchanges on the single most important night of the war in the West, did something that no individual act of sabotage could have achieved alone. The time pencil itself outlived the war by a considerable margin, its basic principle of a chemically or mechanically timed delay influencing fuse and detonator design for decades afterwards, long after the specific chemistry of corroding wire and cupric chloride had been superseded by more reliable electronic and mechanical timers. Surviving examples, alongside related resistance and SOE equipment, can today be seen in collections including the Imperial War Museum in London, usually displayed alongside the unremarkable tins and boxes in which they were once smuggled, a reminder that the most consequential tools of this campaign were deliberately designed to look like nothing at all. Return for a moment to that quiet lane in Calvados in the small hours of June 6, 1944. The saboteur who walked away from that telegraph pole was one of hundreds doing precisely the same thing that same night, across hundreds of separate locations, each acting largely alone, each carrying nothing more sophisticated than a lump of putty-like explosive and a metal tube the size of a pencil. None of them needed to understand chemistry, electronics, or military engineering. They needed only to be told where to press their thumb and how long to wait before walking away. By the time the first landing craft ramps dropped onto the sand at dawn, a telephone network that had taken the better part of a century to build, and years of occupation to extend and reinforce, had been unpicked in a single night by ordinary people using devices that fit easily into a coat pocket. That, in the end, is the real measure of what was achieved at Aston House. Not a single dramatic weapon capable of destroying a tank or sinking a battleship, but a small, unglamorous, endlessly reproducible piece of engineering that allowed an occupied population to become, in effect, the enemy's own signals corps, working in reverse. Every telephone that stayed silent that morning was a small victory bought not with artillery or aircraft, but with a crushed glass vial and a length of slowly corroding wire. No tank rolled over those severed cables. No bomb fell anywhere near them. The damage was done by ordinary people who, a few weeks earlier, had been pressed bread dough, or stitched school uniforms, or driven delivery vans along exactly these same lanes in peacetime. It is rarely the loudest weapon of a war that does the most damage. Sometimes it is the quietest one, the one that makes no sound at all, ticking away in the dark long after the person who said it has already gone home, walked back through a hedgerow, and is once again to any German patrol that might stop them simply somebody cycling home before curfew.